an S&P profile can be linked to an STR profile. And that's by zeroing in on sort of the neighboring regions and examining those. So again, I'm not a biologist or scientist, but I'm an attorney, who has a duty to investigate. And to investigate requires hiring experts to examine this data, this discovery that hasn't been produced yet. And so that's why the minimum practice standard is to get that discovery so that the attorney can then assess that discovery and then retain a qualified scientist to help understand the extent to which the S&P testing will shed light on the reliability of the STR testing that has already been done in the same studies.
Okay, so that having that profile on the S&P can verify the legitimacy of the STR.
Right, so that's my hypothesis. That's what I go to the expert to inquire about. Because again, this is a very much an emerging area of forensic science and litigation.
Sure.
Yes.
I'm going to object again. I don't believe that this witness is qualified to opine on what's needed in these scientific processes. He just indicated that it was his personal hypothesis. I would remove my objection on it.
Well, I'm going to overrule that because I asked the questions. I apologize. Go ahead, ask your next question.
When I'm talking about either the whole genome or the SNP profile, am I looking for just like a sheet of paper that has a bunch of numbers on it, or is there a packet of information that I need to go to my expert?
No, you need the raw data of the profile along with, it's similar to the sort of data that you obtain for the SBR testing. You get the raw data of the profile, you get the laboratory protocols, you get all the bench notes, how the profile was generated, but also you should get the discovery about how the profile was then searched in different databases and family trees constructed.
That was going to be my next question. I heard you say that we can't look at this whole genome sequencing or the SNP in one category and then look at the building the tree to identify from the genetic genealogy piece, the genealogist piece, in its own separate areas. That they're not two separate lanes that they combine.
Yes, they go hand in hand. You do one or the other. I mean, they go together.
Why?
I'm sorry?
Can you tell me why? Can you explain why you say they go together, why I need those?
Well, the SNP profile is what is searched in the ancestry database to then identify, potential relatives, and then family trees are built out. That's the object of the SNP testing. What's important to know from a defense perspective in terms of trial work and potential areas of cross-examination, the government is going to be introducing a statistic that is premised on the assumption of an unrelated universe of people. So what's the chance of finding a profile in a population where there's no relatedness between that profile and anyone in that universe? And so, as you know from talking about this whole concept of forensic genealogy, people who are related have similar DNA. And so the statistics change when you are talking about the chance of finding a profile within a related pool or related universe of individuals. And that's a legitimate area of inquiry on cross-examination for the defense to demonstrate the limitations of the statistical questions that the state is presenting to its expert witness. And to do that, you need to know, for example, who the population of related people are, who is often, from my work on the forensic genealogy, what I've seen is that when a match is found, when the STR match is found, then all building out all further testing stops on the forensic genealogy side. And so it's important to know who hasn't been tested on the related person side in terms of developing cross-examination about the limitations of the statistical tool that the state uses in its case to demonstrate the rarity of the match that you're presenting.
Have you received genetic genealogy materials in your case?
Yes, so which wasn't surprising to me because even though typically the government doesn't seek to introduce the forensic genealogy, in its case, it nevertheless is evidence that is a scientific test of material in the case. And so the discovery rules typically call, and for example, in Maryland, in the District of Columbia, call for discovery of scientific testing of evidence in a case, and that's regardless of whether the government is going to introduce it or not. DC is a little different, where it requires either a materiality showing or that the item is introduced into evidence. And so even when there's a limitation on the item being introduced into evidence, that really goes to the item tested, which here is the environmental sample of trace DNA. And of course, the government has twice tested it. And so for the attorney to be able to fulfill their duty to investigate and satisfy the minimum practice standards, they should have access to the scientific testing of that item of evidence, which is central to the case.
Just 1 minute. Thank you. Mr. Mercer, I don't have any other questions. I'm going to hang on just a minute and trust you.
Thank you.
Ms. Beatty?
Your Honor, I have no questions for this witness. Mr. Knight will be making other arguments.
Okay, thank you. Okay, may this witness be excused?
Amen.
Any objection?
No objection.
Okay, you're excused. You can now stay in the court if you'd like.
Thank you very much, John.
Appreciate you traveling.
Thank you.
Been about an hour. Maybe I need to give the court reporter a break. How about just a short one, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. Okay,
Remember, that will give me time to have our next witness set up.
okay, great. Okay, 10 minutes, and we are off the record. Guys, thank you very much. Please be seated. Okay, record, please. We are back on the record. State Kohberger, case number CR 2922, date 05. Everybody identified previously. Still in the courtroom. And Larkin, Dr. Larkin is sitting, going to be sitting into the witness box, and you are under oath. So go ahead. Well, first, a couple of things. Number one, I'm going to overrule the objection about her foundation to be an expert. And then you were given the opportunity to look at the PowerPoint, and so where are we?
Your Honor, We began to review the PowerPoint and it was immediately apparent to us that we would need to consult with one of our own experts. There's a lot of scientific terms, charts, graphs, etc. We simply are not prepared with this late notice to respond right now. So what we would ask the court to do, so we don't hold things up today, would be to just give us the same opportunity to reserve cross for a later time like the other witness who was just disclosed yesterday.
Okay, great. Okay, so we need to come back again to have more informed cross-examination. But go ahead.
All right. Dr. Larkin, I think we are prepared to start with your PowerPoint now. That just means we might have to come back another day and there might be more questions for you. Are you ready?
Yes.
PowerPoint? All right. I can screen share. There we go. Okay. We are participating in it now. All right. Dr. Larkin, we are going to be talking about genetic genealogy first and how it works. So I'm going to get us to the first slide like that and ask you a question.
I think you need to hit play.
If I hit play, then
Show presentation.
clearly we should have had somebody type.
We need another expert.
Hi. Yes, we need another expert. I think we're ready now.
Yes.
Now, are we going to talk about how genetic genealogy works? I think I do it.
Yes.
Yes. That's genetic. Tell me what kind of DNA genetic genealogy is.
Okay, so DNA is just DNA, but there are a few different inheritance patterns for DNA. So there is mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome DNA, and then what we call autosomal DNA. And those are the main types that we need to
Could you just have that spelled for the court reporter?
autosomal, AUTOSOMAL.
What is
All three.
autosomal?
Okay,
Yeah, sorry.
mitochondrial, 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 and then Y chromosome. Chromosome is it's just the letter Y, and then chromosome CHROMOSOME.
Okay, thank you.
What is autosomal DNA?
So autosomal DNA is inherited from both of your parents, all four of your grandparents, all 8 of your great-grandparents, and so on. That's a little bit different from mitochondrial and Y chromosome. Mitochondrial you only get from your mother, so it just tracks that direct maternal line. Y chromosome DNA is only in chromosomal males, and it goes from father to son, so it tracks the direct paternal line. But autosomal DNA can show relationships on all branches of your tree because you inherited from all of your grandparents and so on.
As a genetic genealogist, do you use one over the other when you do this?
I primarily use autosomal DNA. Mitochondrial DNA does not change very rapidly, so it doesn't give you a really good sense of how closely related you might be to someone. Y chromosome DNA is it changes a little bit more rapidly than mitochondrial DNA, but it's still fairly slow. You could have a match to someone and your connection to them could be back in the 1700s. So it's not going to tell you, who your immediate relatives are. Autosomal DNA can give you a much, I call it kind of depth perception. It gives you a much better sense of how far back in time your connection to that other person is. And that's what's primarily used for adoptee searches. It's what's primarily used in the forensic area as well. So that's just showing the inheritance patterns of the DNA.
Does the autosomal DNA, does that provide more matches so that you can do your work easier?
Yes.
How does this happen? How do you get to do your work?
Okay, so if you're just a regular old genealogist, you will purchase a DNA kit from one of the main testing companies. They will send you a little tube, and you either spit in the tube, and it seems like a lot of spit, or you do a cheek swab. You put that back in the tube and you mail it back to the company. The company will then extract the DNA and do the analysis on it.
As the genetic genealogist, or the person who did the test, what do you get? How do you know when something happens?
Right, when your results are finished, they'll send you an email and you can then log into the website. And once you do that, you will see all of the companies offer what they call ethnicity estimates. And so it will tell you, whether you're descended from, German stock or Scottish or African or, whatever your sort of broader ethnic background is. They will give you a list of matches, which are other people who've taken the same DNA test in the same database and who share DNA with you. So that's the two main things that you get from that.
So the same database, what do you mean by that?
So there are multiple companies that offer these services. So the two biggest ones are Ancestry DNA and 23andMe. So for example, if I tested Ancestry and my sister tested 23andMe, we won't get matched to one another because we're not in the same database.
Where you test is specific to where you're going to find who you're related to.
Right.
Okay. All right. You, as a genetic genealogist, did cases referred to you?
Yes.
Okay. And so how do you get into these databases?
So at Ancestry DNA, there is a sharing system. So the person who's taken the test can essentially authorize me or invite me to view their DNA results, and then I can do that in my own account. I never have to log into their account. At the other services, with the exception of GenMatch, which we haven't gotten to yet, I would have to log into their accounts to see their DNA matches.
You mentioned that, you're backing up a little bit, but you mentioned that you can find out a lot about your ancestry, meaning kind of where you come from. What other kinds of information can you find out?
So, for example, at 23andMe, they offer health reports and trait reports based on your DNA that can tell you if you have a higher than average likelihood of developing certain cancers or certain diseases. They tell you things that are kind of silly, like do you like cilantro, or if you're prone to drinking more caffeine than the average or less. But they can tell all of those things from the DNA test that they've done on them.
And that's only one of the databases that offer that much information?
23andMe does, and then there's a third-party site called Prometheus that you can take your data file and upload it there, and it will run these reports on you. Prometheus, Promethease. And if I got that wrong, it's not because I'm lying.
You changed slides, and now I have the slide that says microwave. What is that?
So a microwave is the actual piece of lab material that we use to run this test. It was designed, so microarrays were designed for biomedical research. They're designed for scientific research. And unlike the STRs that you use for CODIS, microarrays pretty much scan your entire genome. they're looking at, so we talked about autosomal DNA. They look at about 600,000 individual bits of your autosomal DNA. Those are called single nucleotide polymorphisms. So NUCLDOTIDE and then POLYMORPHISM. I feel like I'm in a spelling bee. These are individual bits of DNA that are known to vary among people. Most of our DNA is identical, so looking at those bits are not going to tell you who's related to whom. They look at these microarrays specifically target the chunks of DNA that we know vary between or among individuals. And so that uses higher levels of DNA than you typically have for forensic purposes.
Do you mean more like when you talk about spitting the tumor swabbing the tube, I mean you have to have a lot of it to do this?
You have to have a fair amount of DNA to do a microarray.
What happens if you don't?
Then there is an alternative. There's an alternative method called whole genome sequencing, and then this is there's whole genome sequencing, and the specific way they go about it is called next generation sequencing. And that will actually work on lower levels of DNA. It will work on lower quality DNA, so DNA that might have been broken down because it's been exposed to the elements for a while. That will work better on DNA that's contaminated. So it might have bacterial DNA in it or fungal DNA in it. So that is an alternative approach to microarrays, but it's more labor intensive and it's more expensive.
So you need a microarray or this other way that's more expensive and sounds like more issues with, to get to something that you can put in the computer to find out who you're going
Yes.
to be. What is this?
So this is just kind of a teaching strategy just to show that we have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and I've color-coded the grandparent lines to help us track how the matches fit in.
And when you do autosomal DNA, it's this group of people that you're drawing.
Those are the people who contributed the DNA in you, yes.
What do we have here?
So this is an outline showing how some of your DNA matches might fit into your tree. So you may have some second cousins or first cousins once removed or second cousins once removed who also took the DNA test and are in the same database as you. And they would share DNA with you and would be listed in your matches. And you can see in this diagram, I'm only showing 2 great-grandparent lines. There are actually 4. If the diagram gets too messy if I try to add more. So the thing is, when you get these matches, the DNA company doesn't actually know how you're related to them. It just knows how much DNA you share with them. And so the DNA company is not going to tell you, this is your second cousin. It's just going to say this person shares so much DNA with you, and they could be your second cousin, but they might could be something else. And then it's up to the genealogist to essentially reverse engineer the tree based on the DNA matches.
Do you do that when you have to find out who this person is based on these various matches in different places?
Right.
Do you have experience as a genetic genealogist doing that, where you don't know who this person is, you've got to identify this person based on their kit?
Yes.
So what do you do?
So you will get a list of DNA matches from your testing company, and they are sorted. That list is sorted by how much DNA they share with you. So it's not necessarily sorted by how closely related those people are to you. You get this list, and sometimes they use their real names, the people in the list. Sometimes they use an alias. Depending on the database, you may or may not be able to see their email address. And some of them will have their own family trees linked to their DNA results because they're doing the same thing you are. They're trying to research their family trees. A lot of them won't. And for the people who don't, you have to try to figure out who they are, who their parents are, who their grandparents are, and build trees for them.
Time-consuming process.
It is time consuming.
You talked about shared DNA.
Yes.
That it doesn't tell you how closely related some of this.
Right. So we measure autosomal DNA in a unit called centimorgans, CENTIMORGANS. The more centimorgans you share with someone on average, the more closely you are related. But it's possible, for example, there's a range for most of these relationships. So it's actually possible that you could have a full first cousin who shares less DNA with you than a half first cousin. And that's one of the things that complicates the work with a genealogist. We only have an approximate relationship from the centimorgan amount, not a hard and fast, this is definitely so-and-so relationship.
In your work, when you have your unidentified person and you put the profile in and receive matches in various places, you're looking at these centimorgans
Yes.
to try to get a clue. What do you do after you have this information that tells you about centimorgans?
So I have to essentially build trees for these matches. The first step in the process is to figure out how they are related to one another. Before I can figure out, for example, if I'm trying to help an adoptee find their biological parents. To figure out how they are related to their matches, first I have to figure out how the matches are related to one another. And then I kind of reverse engineer where my adoptee will fit into that family tree based on the DNA results.
What does that like?
So we mentioned earlier one of the tools that I helped to develop for analyzing DNA results. This is a set of screenshots from this shared centimorgan tool. It's also sometimes called the shared centimorgan project tool. That's too many syllables. So what you do is you will type in the centimorgan amount for one of your matches. On the previous slide, the top match was 72 centimorgans. So if I were working that case, I would type in 72 centimorgans into this tool, and you get the diagram there where the possible relationships are highlighted. So your person of interest is your adoptee. In this tool, we'll highlight the possible relationships for a 72 centimorgan match. And if you count up all of the little highlighted boxes on there, there are 30 or 35 possible relationships for somebody who shares 72 centimorgans. And so this is sorry, I'm not supposed to talk.
What, I don't know what the statistic that just popped up is about. What is that?
Okay, so I mentioned that this is a statistical tool that's using probabilities, and so even though there are 30 or 35 possible relationships for a 72 centimorgan match, some of them are more likely statistically than others. And so this panel that is in that tool is listing which of the relationships are most likely. And so there are a group of relationships with, I can't quite read that from here, but I think it says half third cousins. That's the most likely group, and then below that, I think it's third cousins. That's the next most likely group, and has the genealogist. That tells me that I'm going to need to build this person's tree back, probably to second great grandparent level, before I can conceivably figure out where my person of interest fits into that tree.
Is that important to know how far back you have to build that tree?
You have to find the connections among the matches, and you sort of need to know where in the tree to look for that.
I think you told us you have to build trees for each of the matches so that you can find those connectors.
Yes, and I have to build out both sides of a matches tree because I don't know if my person of interest is going to be related on their mother's side or on their father's side. I don't know which grandparent it's through. So I essentially have to build the whole tree back several generations to find the connections.
Are these decisions that you as the genetic genealogist have to make to do your work, finding the matches?
Yes, but I have to continue to build trees things.
Now, do you have to build trees for all of those 35 matches? Or do you do it until you kind of figure out these are the common people?
There are some matches that I may not be able to build trees for. Maybe I can't figure out who they are. So on this slide, there's only 5 matches shown, and you can click. Only 2 of the people of that 5 have posted their own trees. That little icon that I'm pointing the arrows at show that those 2 matches have built their own trees. And so that saves me a lot of work because I can look at their tree and rather than having to build it from scratch, I can, they've listed their parents and their grandparents and I can just go ahead and double check, make sure that they put the right people down, rather than having to build the trees from scratch. The other people, I either have to build their trees from scratch if I can figure out who they are, or sometimes I may just have to skip them if they have a really common name and I don't know where they live or what their age is. I may, if it's a John Smith, I may never be able to figure out who they are and build out a tree for them because there are thousands of John Smiths.
I think this graphic shows us the process and how far you have to build trees for the matches and try to identify the one person. Did I understand that right?
Yes, this is just a simple example where I've built out 2 hypothetical trees for 2 hypothetical matches. In which case, in this examples, I've gone out to the first great grandparents.
What are you looking for?
I'm looking for connections between so match 1 is on the left, match 2 is on the right. I'm looking for commonalities between their 2 trees. I want to see how match 1 and match 2 are related to one another. And so in this case, I've identified, and this is hypothetical, of course, that John Smith and Mary Jones married and had children, and they were the great-grandparents of the person on the left tree. And John Smith and Mary Jones were also the great-grandparents of the match on the right. So now I know that match 1 and match 2 are second cousins to one another. That's kind of the first hook that I have into trying to figure out how my person of interest fits into that tree. And so I would then diagram.
What do you do from there?
Yes, thank you, sorry. I would then start building what I call a descendant diagram, and I will do this in a sketching software. So I have John Smith and Mary Jones, and I've listed their 2 children and their grandchildren, and then I put the DNA matches in there so I can see how the matches are related to one another.
Let me see if I understand this. You took matches to your unknown person and then built their trees out and found great-grandparents or the same great-grandparents
Yes.
to both these other matches to be unknown. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And then you took that match and started figuring out who their kids were and then who their kids had kids. Is that what we're seeing here?
Right, and so what I'm looking for now, so I found these 2, match 1 and match 2, who are second cousins to one another. What I'm looking for now are ways to integrate more DNA matches
Okay.
into that tree that I've just got my hook on.
Why do you want to do that?
Because the more DNA matches I have, the stronger my statistical analysis for where my person of interest fits into that tree.
How do you do
So if I'm working an adoptee case, my goal is to get my adoptee into as many databases as possible. I always call it tested ancestry because that's the biggest database. Then 23andMe because it's the second biggest. And then my heritage is the next in size. And so I want to get them into all of these databases because I can do this. I can build this tree using some matches from Ancestry and some matches from 23 and some from my heritage. And again, I'm doing this so that I have as much statistical data as possible when I try to place my person of interest into that tree.
And that's when you have somebody who's doing their own DNA testing and then sharing their profile with you so you can build a tree out to
Yes.
try to identify who their biological is. I think I got Whether, we'll go to the next slide. It looks like you replaced the people, the matches with numbers. What's
Yes.
going on here?
Those may be hard to see, but in this case, I'm showing an example listing the central organ amounts to the various DNA matches that I've managed to place into this tree.
In this one, you have a whole new red line we didn't have before. How did you figure it out?
So this is a hypothesis, it's an educated guess about where my person of interest might fit into that tree based on how much DNA they share with those 5 matches that I could document. And it might be right, it might be wrong, it's just an educated guess. It's a way to guide my next step in the research.
What is it?
My next step in the research, at this point, might need to dig into another database and see if I can find more matches. I would run the what are the odds analysis tool to see what other hypotheses might fit.
You want to tell me about the what are the odds tool now?
Sure, I can. That's a different slide. So this is the what are the odds tool. You basically build the descendant diagram that was on the previous slide, but into this tool. You enter the centimorgan amounts, so that's the measure of shared DNA. You enter the centimorgan amounts into the WATO tool. Sorry, we call it WATO for short, W-A-T-O. So you enter the centimorgan amounts where those individual DNA matches fit into the tree, and then you can ask the tool to suggest possible hypotheses for you. And that's what those teal boxes are. Those teal boxes are places where the tool is saying your person of interest could fit into this tree in this spot based on the DNA matches.
This tool tells you kind of where to look.
Yes.
In that line. What do you do from there?
So from here, there are several hypotheses there. If you could go back to the previous slide. Thank you. There are several hypotheses there, so what I want to do, and each one of them is going to have a score. And so what I want to do is focus on the hypotheses that have the highest scores, because those are the ones that are most likely. And I might investigate whether, if I'm looking for a birth father, was he in the right place at the time of conception, or was he serving overseas? If he was serving overseas, then I rule him out. I might reach out to members of his family and ask them to do a DNA test for me, because then I can add their DNA match to this analysis and sort of slowly over time focus in on my most likely candidate, for example, if it's the birth father.
Does that mean you reach out to regular people that haven't chosen to do this and see if they voluntarily want to put their DNA in to help build a family tree?
Yes, at times I will do that.
I think we're ready for this slide. Yeah. I'm kind of going through that.
Okay, so this is just it's the same tree, but I'm showing a different scenario in which the DNA matches were lower. They shared less DNA. This is just another hypothetical example to show how the probabilities and the suggested hypotheses will change depending on how much DNA those matches shared with you in the first place.
Does that make your work more complicated?
It does. The lower the DNA matches, the harder it is to actually find what you're looking for.
Is strategic testing, and you're talking about here, is that what you mean when you say something you have to ask people to test?
Yes, some genealogists call it target testing, some call it strategic testing. You're essentially reaching out to people who haven't tested yet and ask them, hey, I want to do a genealogy test for me. And you're doing that to help narrow down the connections.
This one has some arrows pointing us in the direction. What's going on?
Right, I'm afraid you can't see the scores on that tree because it's kind of small. But those arrows are pointing at the hypotheses in this tree that have the highest scores. So that's where I would try to target relatives who might be willing to do a DNA test for me.
And those scores come from the tool,
Those come from the tool and they're,
right? And those give you, I guess, information about which direction's more likely.
yeah, the probabilities are based on the shared centimorgan amounts.
We're gonna shift and talk about forensic genetic genealogy. Tell us what you mean by that.
So forensic is basically pertinent to any sort of legal proceeding or court case, not a lawyer. So if I got that wrong. But in this case, sometimes so the Department of Justice calls this work forensic genetic genealogy. A lot of practitioners call it investigative genetic genealogy, but it's the same thing.
Does that mean it's work that's done for law enforcement?
It's work that's done for law enforcement, and it's also done, oftentimes I think the client might actually be a medical examiner if you're dealing with an unknown human remains.
Do you do that kind of work?
I do not.
Have you been taught about that?
I have learned a bit about it, yes.
How have you learned it?
I've learned about it by communicating with practitioners who do it, and also by attending conferences and watching recorded videos.
Did you know that you wanted to?
Yes.
There's no other qualifications you need other than what you have right
No, not at the moment.
now. The slide talks about the kind and quality of DNA. What kind of DNA is needed for forensic DNA? What kind is used?
So you can use any type of DNA the same as you would use for regular genealogy. You could do mitochondrial, you could do Y chromosome, you could do autosomal, and as I mentioned before, most of this work is using autosomal DNA. And the difference is that if somebody's spitting in a tube, they're providing a lot of DNA, and they're providing clean DNA, and they're providing DNA that gets preserved with the fluid to keep it from breaking down. And that's not always the situation that you're going to find at either crime scenes or if you're dealing with unknown human remains.
I know we talked about the microarray a while ago, and that there was another way to get this profile to do your work.
Yes,
Is that where we're going?
that's where we're going.
Tell me about that.
Okay,
Exactly.
so next generation genome sequencing is a technique that you can use to analyze the entire human genome. You're not just focusing on the 600 or 700,000 bits that the genealogy company uses. You're trying to sequence the whole thing. And that can sometimes work when there's not enough DNA for a microarray.
How is that done?
It's hard to explain. So I'm using this graphic to try to explain. So imagine that the solid red line at the top is the entire genome that we're trying to analyze. Next genome sequencing actually focuses on little subsets, and it's kind of like skimming a document. So if you skim a document, you're not reading every single word. Next generation sequencing is not trying to read every single little bit of DNA along the way. Instead, it's skimming little bits, and it's missing a lot on the first skim. And then it skims it again, and it will miss some on the second skim, but it might pick up bits it didn't pick up the first time. And so it keeps skimming the DNA, and after the analysis is done, you can kind of reconstruct from the little snippets that you skimmed along the way, and you can post the next gap. So these are the portions in gray that were skimmed in the multiple episodes, and those are called reads in the next generation sequencing process. The more reads you do, the more of the genome you can reconstruct, and the more confident you can be that you did it correctly. Because sometimes if you're skimming a word, you might, the word might be there and you read there because you were reading too fast, right? So the more times you skim an individual piece of DNA, the more confident you can be that it was called accurately.
Is there a number of times that's practiced skin?
So for medical research, for biomedical research, the companies who sell this equipment recommend that you do 30 times. They call it a 30 times coverage to get a confident read. Oftentimes in forensic work, they're not able to get 30x reads, and so they're working with fewer skimming. And that skimming is not a technical term. I'm just using the analogy to teach this.
Talk about missing information when you skim. This slide says that it's filled in by a word called indication. Is that
Yes.
what this slide means?
So if you can't do 30x coverage of the genome, which is often the case when you're working with low quantities of DNA or contaminated DNA, you won't get the whole genome. There'll be missing pieces. This is a stage of the process called bioinformatics, and you actually have a specialist who goes in and uses statistical methods to try to fill in the pieces that were missing in the initial analysis.
Does that mean that person's projecting what would be there? Is that showing us that?
That's showing us the parts that were imputed. That's the term that we would use.
All right, once you have this information, after bioinformatics has added their details, then what happens?
So recall that the next generation sequencing is analyzing the entire genome, but the genealogy companies, the matching databases, are not interested in the entire genome. They're not going to analyze the whole genome. They only want the SNPs, so the SNPs, that were analyzed by the microarray. So now the bioinformatician has to go in, essentially delete a whole bunch of the whole genome data so that they're only left with the portions that would have been on a microarray had they done a microarray in the first place.
And this happens after they're filled in to make a whole, then they're stripped back to make it usable.
Yes.
By genealogy database. How do you know if you're not just left with all of those filled in things?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the question.
So when these are stripped back out so that they're usable, so they become an SNP, it's usable. This is after the imputation.
Right.
How do you know what is left?
How do you know which parts were imputed and which parts were from the next generation sequencing?
Yes.
The bioinformatician would have access to that data, but as a genealogist, you wouldn't know.
Okay. That question will be for somebody different.
That would be for someone
After the SNP is created, then
different. So then you have a file that would look just like what you could get from one of the actual genealogy testing companies, and you can upload that. If it's a forensic kit for forensic purposes, you can upload that to two main databases. One of them is called Family Tree DNA, which in the trade we generally just call FTDNA, and the other one is GenMatch. And there are a couple of smaller databases, but they're really tiny.
you can go to Ancestry.
No. Ancestry will not let you upload a file into the database, nor will one bring.
They have to
There's
do
no
their own
process to do it. The only way to get into those two databases is by spinning it.
All right, on this slide, does this represent most of these companies that do the genetic analysis?
Those are all of the main companies. There are a few smaller ones, but they're really quite tiny, and often for those we don't even have decent estimates of how large they are.
By large, do you mean the number of people that have uploaded a profile or spin in a tube so one's created?
Yes.
Compare. And I think you let us know that law enforcement uses and can only use GenMatch and Family Tree DNA.
Per the terms of service of the companies, They're only allowed to use Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch, and there are two smaller dedicated databases. One of them is called DNA Justice, which has, as of yesterday, about 500 people in it. And the other one is DNA Solved, which is owned by Optum, and I have no idea how many people are in it.
Those two that you just talked about, can anybody use those, or are those only law enforcement can use those?
DNA Solves and Optum.
Yes.
Yes, those are only for law enforcement. A regular genealogist wouldn't have access to any output from those. You can voluntarily contribute your DNA, but then you can't use it for your own genealogy.
And GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, are those law enforcement only, or are those usable by others?
Those are usable by regular genealogists, and both of them existed long before the field of forensic genealogy did.
But they also allow.
They both allow law enforcement to upload the kits, the DNA kits, into their databases.
My heritage, I don't think we've talked a ton about that. I understand Ancestry and 23, we have to give your own sample, they do their own thing. But my heritage, how do you have to do this fitness proof for that?
No, so MyHeritage sells DNA tests, as does Family Tree DNA. So you can send a kit in. Those are cheek swabs, they're not spit. That's technical. But for both MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA, you could test directly with them, but you could also take your data file from one of the other companies and just upload the file. And it's just a text file that has thousands and thousands of lines of DNA data.
So as a genetic genealogist, you are working with somebody and you can take their profile that was made at 23andMe and put it in MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA.
Yes.
And you also put it in GEDmatch.
Yes.
And law enforcement can only search Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch. Can they search your person?
If there's a DNA match to my person, they will see that match.
Okay. Does your person have to agree, law enforcement, to let that happen?
If we're talking about my adoptee, so it's complicated because the rules have changed continually over the past few years. As it currently stands at GEDmatch, if we were to take a brand new kit, a brand new adoptee client, and upload their data to GEDmatch, we would have to consent. The client would have to either consent or decline to consent to participate in law enforcement matching.
If they decline to participate and law enforcement searches GEDmatch, then they should not see your clients. Is that
They
right?
should not see my clients.
Okay. Same with Family Tree DNA?
Family Tree DNA, the system is kind of the inverse. If you add a kit to Family Tree DNA, they automatically opt you in. There is a way to opt yourself out, but you kind of have to know where to find it. It's not obvious.
Again, a person can keep their information private, so it doesn't wind up in law enforcement searches.
They yes.
Family Tree DNA. And MyHeritage is different, law enforcement shouldn't upload.
MyHeritage explicitly prohibits it.
Did I just ask you all questions that related to the arrows?
No. So the database, the total database at Family Tree DNA and the total database at GEDmatch are both larger than the number of people who opted in. So not everyone at Family Tree DNA has opted into law enforcement matching. Not everyone at GEDmatch has opted into law enforcement matching. And so the arrows are the gray bars are showing my estimates. And these are my personal estimates for the number of people in each of those databases who are officially accessible to law enforcement for matching.
And that's because those companies have two categories of.
Yes.
I think we're now to the last section where we're going to talk about the work products of genetic genealogy. What does that topic mean?
So these are if I have an adopted client, this is what I would give the client at the end of our agreement. These are the products that I would give them, and basically everybody who's doing forensic genealogy that I know of, except possibly the FBI, originally trained as a genetic genealogist. So this is what we are all used to giving to our clients.
What are we seeing on this first slide that you did to your client?
Okay, so those are two of the match lists. The one on the left is what a typical match list looks like at GEDmatch. The one on the right is what a typical match list looks like at Family Tree DNA. For my clients, I will actually screenshot the matches and put that in the appendix to my report. I also copy all of the matches into another program because sometimes people will, they'll be in the match list of my adoptee and then they'll disappear. And so I like to have a record that, hey, when I uploaded this kit, I had these matches there. So even if they decide to delete their kit later, I still have a record that they shared so and so much DNA with my client.
This looks like a family tree.
It does look like a family tree, and it's anonymized. There are no real.
Dr. Larkin, what are we seeing on this family tree?
So this is the family tree that I would have built for my client, and this would have attached to it documentation, so birth and death records. It would have census records if I was able to find the family in the census, immigration records, any sort of documentation that I might find. I often will link obituaries if I find them, if I find family photos. A lot of times you might find articles in the newspaper, and I will link everything that I find to this family tree that I then give the client.
Does that help verify for your client that the results you gave them were accurate?
Yes, it helps verify that all of the relationships that I'm reporting to them are documented and yeah.
And it looks like you give them a copy of the descendant diagram.
I
do. And you give them a copy of the what are the odds?
I do.
And a written report.
I do. If the client requests it, I will write a report for them.
Other than those things that you give your clients, what would be available on the forensic side of a genetic genealogy?
Right, so they should have the original DNA data file, whether it was microarray or the next generation sequencing. I don't need to give that to my client because they had that when they came to me. There are some complications when you're dealing with forensic DNA because I didn't have a person spit a whole bunch of DNA into a tube. Sometimes you might have a mixture where more than one person is represented in the sample. So that needs to be analyzed, and there presumably would be documentation associated with that analysis, which is called deconvolution, DECONVOLUTION. If there was not, if there was non-human DNA contamination mixed in with the sample, sometimes, and not always, sometimes they will do what is called enrichment, where they're trying to increase the proportion of DNA that is human in that sample. If that process was done at the lab, there should be a record of it. The bioinformatics that we talked about, so imputing any missing data and then stripping out all of the non-genealogical DNA points, all of those there should be records of.
Oh, I think you have logins or kit numbers.
Right. So when you have once you've gone through all these steps, you've done what we call the wet lab work, where you're actually working with the samples, and then you've done the computer analyses. You end up with the output file that mimics. It's like a fake microarray file, right? So it mimics the data that we would have gotten from a genealogy company. GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA both charge law enforcement to use their database, and so there should be some sort of contractual agreement or receipts that you paid the company for the upload. And then there are logins, because for you to be able to see the matches, you have to log into that account. You have to have access. You have at Family Tree DNA, you have to log into that specific account. At GenMatch, I believe you can give access to a few different researchers, but they have to know what's called the KIT number, which is the unique identifying number for that kit.
When you said eight microarrays, it reminded me that when we talked about microarrays, you told us that those contain a ton of personal medical information.
Yes.
This also has all of this?
Yes.
And do you, because there's so many more, I guess, people or kids or profiles in my heritage, is that a place that somebody that can find a match might want to know?
Yes.
Dr. Larkin, thank you. I don't have any other questions, but don't leave quite yet. I'll pass it to your mic.
Thank you. Any cross-examination?
You never heard back on her.
Okay, thank you. All right, may this witness be excused?
Yes.
Okay, so you're excused. You can stay here if you like, or you can get on with your life. Thank you. It's very educational. Well, it's 1 o'clock. I think it's a good time to break, maybe until 2. How much longer do you think?
Your Honor, I have 2 additional witnesses. I believe Dr. Larkin was going to be by far the longest witness. I think the next 2 will be, I would hope, not more than an hour combined. Maybe not even take that long. And then argument, Your Honor, and know we're going to take up the state's second order request.
Sure. Okay, great. We'll reconvene at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you a question and then come back to it in a minute. What kind of work do you currently do?
I am an investigative genealogist and also a woodworker.
Woodworking sounds really interesting. I think we're going to focus on your investigative genealogy today. But before we talk about your work history, I want to know a little bit more about your educational background. After high school, did you have more formal education?
I did. I went on to the College of San Mateo and received a degree and certificate in administration of justice and post certification. And then I went on to San Jose State University and studied criminology and with a minor in sociology.
Did you graduate?
I did.
And was that with a bachelor's degree?
It was.
What year was that?
Year were we in? I want to say 2010 maybe. Or not. I don't remember.
Has it been a few years since you graduated?
It's been 5 years.
Right. Did you take any courses in forensic genetics?
At that time, this did not even exist. And the courses only have started to recently come out. There is no current standard of certification for the work of an investigative genetic genealogy.
Is that newer in your college education degree?
Absolutely. This is a technique that only has come to light in the last 5 years.
And now we're talking about the forensic investigative genetic genealogy.
Yes.
How did you get interested in that?
I really had no knowledge of it when I got involved. I had some health issues that I was going through and needed genetic testing. Unfortunately, my insurance wouldn't cover it, so I took a direct-to-consumer DNA test and used the results to upload to a medical site. In the process of that, I found out that my father was not my father, and I then went on a mission to figure out how to identify who my biological father was.
So personally involved and invested, but very much self-taught.
100% self-taught. And this was a time in my life where I was going through cancer treatment. I had a very short prognosis of lifespan left and became incredibly depressed. And so once I identified my biological father, I then wanted to give back. And so I started a free online Facebook group for people who had gotten the same results or were adopted or donor conceived, and I started finding their relatives for them.
That turned into you attending the trainings for genetic genealogy.
So at the time, I did not. So in 2018, in the spring, is when I started doing just genetic genealogy, which is the same concept essentially, but you're just doing it with adoptees, donor conceived and unknown parentage cases. I did a lot of online readings and reading scholarly articles, watching tutorials, just learning about the technique itself. I didn't have any involvement in investigative genetic genealogy until August 2019, when I was asked to join one of the companies that provides that service.
When you joined that company, did they train you in those methods?
No, they actually presume that you have to know what you're doing in order to be a part of the team, and so the presumption is made that you already have enough experience. I continued my own education and training by attending conferences, doing workshops, following other pioneers in the field that had successful case rates, and continued to just educate myself through what I could find on the internet, because at that time, certification programs, accreditation, any sort of courses, they didn't exist. Those are very, very recent things that have come out.
You mentioned that there were groups of people that you learned from and worked with. Did you check your work or have them check your work as you learned?
Oh, absolutely. The first company, so I've worked for two well-known companies in this industry, and then I have created since my own company. One of the first company, you worked individually on cases, but it's a collaboration amongst the team, and so you keep each other up to date on what's going on. You ask for advice, guidance, help. The second company that I worked for was more of a team structured way of working cases, and that was at the point when I began actually training all incoming volunteers that wanted to get to learn how to work these cases.
That first company you worked for, what was that called?
Identifinders International.
And how many years did you work for Identifinders?
Just over 2.5 years.
And that's where you did investigating genetic genealogy and other teenage detective work.
Yes, with Identifinders, I only did suspect cases, so only murder and rape, violent crime, cases. They did not do Doe cases at the time that I was working with them.
So you're talking about those kind of cases that you did, those were for law enforcement, you were identifying somebody that was unknown. for law
Yes.
enforcement. Okay, and you worked with checks there while you did that for 2.5 years.
Yes,
Okay. The next place you worked, what was that?
the DNA Doe project.
What do you mean by that? You mentioned that in your last.
Doe is an unidentified remains. The DNA Doe project specifically takes on adult Doe cases, not baby cases. So I work those cases on my own with my company, but it's identifying not suspects, only unidentified remains.
And you were not law enforcement there, you were not doing anything for law enforcement there, so it's a little bit different, do I understand that right?
So for both companies, we were working on behalf of law enforcement. We would contract these cases with law enforcement, but law enforcement was not in fact working the case. The genealogists were working the cases.
Okay. For law enforcement to get it answered.
Yes.
All right, and so how long did you work at that place?
I was with the DNA Doe project for about 2 years.
And is that where you did some teaching and training about genetic genealogy?
Yes.
From there, where did your career take you?
Well, I ended up opening my own company, but the DNA Doe project offered me the opportunity to be an intake specialist. So my primary role was when somebody was interested in doing this type of work and wanted to learn the technique, we would bring them on board, and I was the one who would teach them the process. So all new volunteers were on a specific case that was run by me, and I would not only train them, but also check their work, make sure that they were documenting things properly and that the documents matched with the proper person that they had put in the tree. I also, the University of New Haven had also started a forensic investigative genetic genealogy course that you could take that had a practicum at the end of it. The DNA Doe project was the first organization that took on a cohort of students. The first year of this course that was offered, it wasn't fine-tuned. So the students that I took on for the internship, there were 6 students in total, they really had very limited knowledge of the technique, of the meaning of anything really. And so I would spend hours training them, and at the end of 7 weeks, I led them to a solve of a case.
You were trusted with me.
Yes, I was.
Do you know roughly how many law enforcement forensic investigative genetic genealogy cases you worked?
I have worked just for law enforcement cases probably around 25 to 30.
And the Doe project, how many of those kinds of cases?
So that would include all cases.
The 25 includes the Doe cases?
Yeah, it's about 25 to 30 would encompass any case that I have worked that is law enforcement case, not including the cases that were unknown parentage cases.
And of the other kinds of genetic genealogy, how many times have you worked with case in genetic genealogy other than that?
How many cases? Minimum 25. I still have people every day who, it depends. Some people just don't know what any of this means. And so it's as simple as just looking at their matches and explaining it to them, and they do it on their own. But actually working cases, probably another 25 to 30 that are just unknown parentage cases.
And have you testified before in court?
I have not.
Let's talk about what brings you here. How did you get involved in our case with Bryan?
I was contacted by defense. Well, I take that back. I was contacted by somebody in this field. I don't know if I could say who it was or if it's relevant. Asking if I would be willing to talk to the defense. And I agreed, and I had that, it was a Zoom call in which I was asked basically just to explain the process in which I go through from start to finish on a case. So what is, from when law enforcement contacts me to when I provide the investigative lead back to law enforcement, what is the process? And that was the extent of my involvement at the time.
Ms. Vargas, what I want to do is I want to briefly run through that. What do you do when law enforcement calls you when you get there? What's your first step?
So it's a complex, it's very complex. Essentially, law enforcement will contact me and say they have a case that they are unable to solve, and they would like to, they like my services. I first evaluate what type of case is it, and are there any, what is the DNA that is involved? Do we have to extract the DNA? Have you already extracted the DNA? So there's a lot of preliminary questions. Once we establish that and they agree to take, have me take on the case, I have them set up to ship the sample, whether it be something that needs to be extracted to the lab that does that, or DNA that's already been extracted that needs to be sequenced. The law enforcement agency will then send that to a third-party forensic lab. At that point, when the lab receives the sample, I essentially take over the case until I provide the genetic lead back to, or the investigative lead back to the agency. In the meantime, I will stay in contact with usually the detective and provide updates on, did it pass quality check in the lab? It's being sequenced now. The data file has been complete. It's gone through bioinformatics. I've uploaded it, to GEDmatch. Do you want to upload to FTDNA, Family Tree DNA, because there's an additional charge for that. And so I keep them kind of abreast as to what's going on, but essentially the case is it's mine. It's in my control until I am done.
And do you, during those communications with law enforcement, do you take their direction, and if they say stop working, you stop working?
Absolutely. The case belongs to them. It is not my case. It is not my data. I am providing a service for them. The only request that I have is they not have another company work the case at the same time, because it's just a lot of work that you go through. But I am at their direction. Yeah, I don't.
So it's not as easy as just getting a profile and sticking it in your computer and having it.
Oh, absolutely not. I've had cases that have taken me 14 months to solve.
Why, you mentioned you use GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA, but there's an extra fee involved in that. Can you explain that a little more?
So there's only there's many direct-to-consumer databases, Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, all of which you can order from the company a DNA test, spit in the tube, and send it off back to the company. Ancestry and 23andMe allow you to download your data and upload free to these other sites as a normal consumer. Law enforcement cases, however, are only permitted to be uploaded into Family Tree DNA and to GEDmatch for a fee. GEDmatch, however, is not a direct-to-consumer testing site. It is only a database where people take their test results from the company in which they tested and upload this site to the site to get more matches, essentially, or higher, closer relatives, higher matches.
Does law enforcement have access to all of GEDmatch?
If properly uploaded, there is a fee that you must pay. You must upload through a separate database than the one in which consumers upload through. You must pay the fee, and you, depending on the case, may be limited on the matches that you are able to see.
Why is that?
The terms of service have changed several times since the Golden State Killer case came out, and which investigative genetic genealogy became very popular. It used to have everyone opted in, then GEDmatch opted everybody out, and you had to choose to opt into law enforcement matching as a consumer. Then it decided to automatically opt DOE cases in. So to break that down, if you were to take a DNA test in Ancestry and want to upload to GEDmatch, when you input that file, it's going to ask you, do you consent to law enforcement matching? And if you hit no, and I am working violent crime non-DOE case, I should not be able to see that you are a match to my unknown DNA contributor.
You said should not.
Should not.
Does it happen anyway?
It does. It has.
And is that because there's a problem with GEDmatch? It's just if you upload it and all of a sudden these things that shouldn't happen did?
There are a lot of tools that are available in GEDmatch. These tools allow you to make comparisons of two or more people and how they relate to each other and share DNA. One of these tools allows you to compare many matches, not only against your DNA profile that you're working, but also against all of their matches to see if their matches match each other. When you utilize this tool, there is a feature that you can edit the list of kits that are originally selected.
What does that mean? Edit the list? Yes.
So when you upload your profile, it takes about 24, 48, 72 hours max to batch and tokenize in the system. It then produces a list of matches, okay? And these matches are biological relatives to the unknown DNA contributor. We don't know right away what relationship they are, but they are all biological relatives, okay? One of the tools is called the matrix tool. And what the matrix does is it compares the match, the DNA profile against a specified number of the profile's matches. So for example, if I run the profile's kit number, they're all given a kit number. If I run the profile's kit number and I compare it to 100 of the profile's top matches, it will in turn compare the profile to all of the matches and all of the matches to everyone on that list of 100 people. Okay?
I think I see what you're saying. Let me make sure. So you have one person, you get a list of their matches, but this tool also gives you a list of those matches.
So it's a multi-step process. So initially, if I am putting my subject's DNA in the system, I don't know who it belongs to, I put their kit number in. You get a kit number after you upload the data, okay? I put the kit number in, I run a tool called one-to-many, and it's gonna show the top 500 matches that this subject has. I then would go to utilize the manipulation tool, the loophole. You would then go click the top match and run their matches. So the top match of your subject's top match, you would run their matches, okay? Once you run their matches, there is a tool that allows you to edit that list of matches. So we're looking at the matches of the subject's top relative, not the subject's matches, right? When you edit the kit list, if you put the subject's kit number into this tool that you're going to now analyze, these matches, it tricks the system and allows you to see matches that you wouldn't have seen when you ran your initial match list.
And those can include people that did not agree with law enforcement to see their DNA.
Those matches that are revealed are only matches that have been opted out.
And that is only the ones that are supposed to see.
They're only the ones. If you see that the subject matches one of these people, because again, you're not looking at your subject's matches, you're looking at that person's top cousin, let's say, that top cousin's matches, right? When you put your subject's kit number in there, you're gonna see now his kit, her kit, compared against the matches of their top match. When you find, you then scroll down and you look, oh, here's the match for 100 centimorgans. You go back to your screen where you have your list of your subject matches and you say, I don't have a match with 100 centimorgans. That proves that that person has opted out of law enforcement matching, but I'm still able to see them.
And so that's a way to use the tool to get past what law enforcement is supposed to do.
I struggle with this. I'm sorry. It is a tool that is provided in the database that essentially allows you to see things that you're not supposed to see. And as a result of seeing those things, you're then using that match to find to identify your subject. So you're violating the terms of service by seeing these matches.
This is in general.
This is in GenMatch.
How about family tree DNA? That's the other law enforcement strategy.
There's two things that I'm aware of in family tree DNA. One is not paying to upload. So there's very strict parameters when it comes to law enforcement kits. One of the parameters is if you as a consumer are a match to a law enforcement kit, you cannot see that kit as a regular consumer. So law enforcement kits can see everybody in the database that have opted in. Now, Family Tree also has an opt-in out feature that is not the same as GenMatch. You have to go into the settings and find it and toggle whether or not you choose to opt in or out. Many people are unaware of this. Another instance is uploading the data as if you were a consumer. You bypass the fees that you're supposed to pay to Family Tree DNA for a law enforcement kit, whereas a consumer it's free. And you also get full access to the database, including matches that have opted out.
Does this happen?
Yes.
If I'm an attorney and I have a case where genetic genealogy is then utilized by law enforcement, and I want to know if they follow the protocols and rules, do I need the genetic genealogy information that, like you produce as a forensic genetic genealogist? Do I need that information so I don't know?
If you wanted to know what the process was, whether or not there was work product, if you wanted to verify how did you come to your conclusion, absolutely.
How about if I wanted to know if the rules were broken?
You would need the data. You would need to see the data.
Just a second, while I check my notes. I do have another question about another database, Mercer. Is that one that law enforcement uses?
Many in this industry have been known to upload to MyHeritage. Essentially, these databases, you're only bound by the terms of service. And there are workarounds in every one of the databases that somebody knows about and has told you about, or you yourself have tried. There's really no justification for it. You think you're doing the right thing, you want to help, and
There's a lot of information in genetic genealogy.
there is. It is a very tedious process. There is a lot of time, effort, and work that goes into it. In the end, what I provide to law enforcement is an investigative lead, and it is up to the agency to then take over their case and confirm that my lead is in fact correct.
How does law enforcement upload to my bedroom?
So the upload to these databases is you go to the website, you create a free account, you take the data file, you hit upload, and voila, you've got now a list of matches. It's the same as a regular consumer would do in both MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA. GEDmatch law enforcement uploads now through a separate portal called GEDmatch Pro. But there are instances of people doing work on behalf of law enforcement uploading to GEDmatch through the consumer portal as if it were a consumer kit.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions. I'm not sure if prosecutor does.
Okay, thank you. This one must be excused. Right. Thank you, Ms. Vargas. Appreciate you.
Your Honor, our last witness is Becca Barlow. And I think she's probably in the small library.
Be sure to check out my other videos and playlists for more true crime content. And if that's not enough, you can join our Patreon. Don't have a tinfoil hat? It's okay. We'll make you one. It's that easy. See you guys in the next video.
See you later. Bye.